Okay, great. So, welcome everyone. I've done a handful of Zoom talks, well, maybe a large handful of Zoom talks like this since COVID kind of made this a thing that we do now. And I'll be honest, I would much rather us go walk around the woods. But this way I can at least share with you a few places and features that we could never get to all of them in a day because they're in various states. So this will be a little bit of a of a widely traveled um, uh, showcase. So have a look at this image. I wish I was so talented that I painted this. This is a very talented woman named Autumn von Plinsky. She's a friend of mine, and I often pull her in on projects I do where I want her to paint particular scenes or a piece of someone's property as a cover of a report or something. And this is a little patch of forest in Northwest Connecticut. And I just want you to have a look at this for a moment. And I want you to think about if you were going to try to uh, reconstruct this scene, how this place came to be the way it is right now, what features would you look for? What are the field marks that would help you kind of put all these elements into a sequence of time, sort of into a narrative?
The size of the trees and the type of tree.
Yeah, that's great. So you're going to look at species composition. What species is it? These in particular, I will tell you, are sugar maples.
Mm-hmm.
If you had said white oaks, I would accept that as an answer, but really only those two species. It doesn't really look like much of anything else. And sugar maple is a very shade tolerant tree. It requires nutrient rich soils. And so there's this sort of particular factors that come together that allow sugar maple to be there. As I go through this talk, I'll share a few other species with you, and they have very different needs from sugar maple. So we look at composition and we look at structure. What is the sizing, the spacing, the arrangement of trees and plants, as well as sort of the inanimate features like the stones and other things. So we'll circle back to this image here in a few minutes. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. I do want to mention two people that were kind of an influence on me, just if you want more further reading on the topic. So this meet Mae Watts. Mae Watts was a Chicago gal roaming around in I guess, the early to middle 1900s into the third quarter of the 1900s. And she wrote this wonderful book called Reading the Landscape of America. And she's kind of traveling all around. She's a brilliant writer and also an artist. She's got all kinds of drawings in here. And it's just, I can't say enough good things about her. Just put up a few quotes from her here. She studied under a guy named Henry Cowles, who was a ecologist in the first half of the 1900s, developed a lot of the theory around succession, about how forests emerge from old fields, about how sand dunes along the shores of Lake Michigan change over time. So really good stuff. She wrote a sequel book called Reading the Landscape of Europe that, I'll be honest, I think is a little bit more interesting, only because Europe has such cultural diversity, and she kind of goes country by country, sort of teasing out how you can see the variability in the culture embedded into the landscape. So it's really, really wonderful stuff. And the other, of course, is Tom Wessels. You may have his book, Reading the Forested Landscape. And Tom was my graduate advisor, my mentor, still a very good friend to this day. And what Tom did that was unusual was he kind of put forward that ecology can be understood through a lens of history. Not always human history. Some of the history is just nature, natural history, like beavers and abandonment of beaver meadows and ponds. But really, the crux of his book, Reading the Forested Landscape, was around land use history and agriculture and logging and all that kind of stuff. So those are two. He's many, many books, but those are the two that are kind of relevant for what we're talking about. And I have one vocabulary word for you to learn tonight, um, and that is a palimpsest. And if I had you all in the room, I'd ask how many people know this word. And generally, very few people know what this word is. And it's Old Greek, and it was specifically referring to stone tablets, in that you'd have a stone tablet with all your text etched out in it, and then you're like, well, I don't really want this text here anymore. So you scrape it clean, but you could still see traces of the earlier text underneath what the new words that you wrote on there. The same is true for a landscape. A landscape is made or worked upon for one purpose and later reused for another. So this image is from Scotland. And this 2,000 years ago, this was all covered in a Caledonian pine forest. So Scotch pine, which is widely planted in the Northeast in older kind of timber plantations from the first half of the 1900s. This was all covered in that. There aren't any of those trees here in this image. There is, just out of the frame here, when I walked through here, there was an old bog that had stumps of Scotch pine in it, and you could still see the axe marks in the stumps from when the Romans cut them down 2,000 years ago.
Oh my God.
So the landscape was modified. Then you have all these conifer plantations in the background. Those are all North American species like Sitka spruce and Douglas fir, different periods planted, mostly after World War II, when the UK sort of realized, having some natural resources isn't a bad idea. So they went through this big planting period. I don't know if the stone wall is 100 years old or 1,000 years old. It really doesn't matter. The point is that the landscape gets etched and etched and etched by different people at different times with different motivations. And you can't understand the present without understanding the past and how we got to this place. So the natural landscape is our starting point. When I was out with Wendy and Alan a year ago, we were up on the ridge in kind of this chestnut oak, kind of blueberry, very dry oak community type, very fire adapted community type. And that's very typical for that ridgetop sort of environment. And a natural community is an assemblage of plants such as those that repeats across the landscape. So I can find that same chestnut oak blueberry community up here where I am on dry rocky ridge tops. I can find it in Pennsylvania. I can find it in New Jersey. I can find it in Virginia, because that same sort of environmental conditions, acidic bedrock, shallow soils, very dry environment, where that community, where those physical factors are found, the community type tends to show up. So we have lots and lots of different community types here in New York State and in the Northeast. Most of the states have described their community types. You can just go on and do a web search for New York State natural communities, and you'll get the maybe to some degree overwhelming PDF of all the different natural communities in New York. This is a brilliant book about the natural communities of New Hampshire, and I've just scanned out this one image. There's many in this book of kind of doing the same thing. And what they're doing here is they're kind of taking you on a little transect through the forest and showing you in this first line here the parent material. So different substrate types will lead to different natural communities. So over on the right, this dry, coarse sand, that's what we get up here as a pitch pine. The Albany Pine Barrens is a good example of that. And then you kind of go through different community types. You get up on the top of the ridge, it's dry, shallow, and rocky, kind of like we saw when I was out with Wendy and Alan a year ago. And then they kind of break it down into different, if you're in central New Hampshire, it's like this. If you're in southern New Hampshire, it's like this. Some of this is relevant for where we are here you all in the Hudson Valley, me kind of in the far upper reaches of the Hudson Valley. But the point here is, the takeaway is that depending on your substrate and your disturbance and the topography of the land, different natural communities will pop up. And people then rework or modify those natural communities. It's not very often that you can go to the top of a ridge and find agricultural field marks. People just didn't farm those places very often. Occasionally they did, but they tended to be sort of marginal landscapes with people who were kind of living on the margins, either economically or whatever. So now let's get into some of these field marks of landscape history and land use history. So the first thing, if you were with Tom Wessels, he would say the first thing you do when you walk into a forest is to look at the ground. And we'll get into these all in a moment. So the ground has lots of field marks. I look for stones and other legacies like stone walls, clearance cairns, barbed wire, all that kind of stuff. We'll get into them. Trees and tree shape, as was mentioned in the very first slide, the species of trees are very important. That can tell you a lot about a site. And then tree shape, was that tree forest grown? Was that tree open grown? Is it a resprout because it was cut at one time? And et cetera, et cetera. And then lastly, understory and indicator species. So exotic species, weeds, indicators of very rich sites like blue cohosh or maidenhair fern, or indicators of very acidic sites like rattlesnake plantain, or on and on and on. Lots of different plants. They like to find themselves in their particular set of circumstances. So have a look at this image. And of course, since I just told you how you walk into a forest, you all are looking at the ground, right? You're not looking at the trees. And would you say this ground is smooth like a soccer field, or is it pitted, mounded, and undulating?
Under what? Oh,
So,
undulating.
yeah, pitted, mounded, and undulating. Or is it smooth like a soccer field? You're being recorded, so don't mess this up.
It's pitted, mounded, and undulating.
There's a little bit of topography in there. Anyone feel like it's smooth?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go with smooth. So if you look through here, I mean, this is, and I'm going to show you pitted, mounded, and undulating in a moment, and so maybe that'll put it into a little better context for you. But this is completely smooth ground. If you took the trees out of this picture, you could do whatever you want in here. Kick a ball around, run around with your eyes closed, whatever you want, because this is an old plowed field. This is an old farm field. And that's confirmed for us by the composition and structure. So these are tulip poplar trees. These are early successional, sun-loving species. And if you look at their sizes, we would call this even-sized or even-aged. All these trees came up together. There's a few small ones. These are understory trees that are starting to pop in. But the broad pattern here is that all these trees are 10 inches to 14 inches in diameter, and they're all basically the same. That's different from this site, and this is an old growth hemlock forest, where even though it's on a slope, this is kind of on a hillside. It's very typical for old growth hemlock to occur in that kind of situation. The ground, there's sort of a big pit here. There's rocks. There's a pit there with a mound, and so all these pits and mounds are places where trees have blown over in the wind. The roots have ripped out of the ground, leaving a depression. And then that soil over time falls back down to the ground, leaving the pit, or the mound, sorry. And so when we see that, we know that a place has not been tilled for agriculture, has not been plowed, unless it's under very specific substrate types. Field marks in trees. This tree on the left, these are both field marks for very old trees. I really like helping people to identify old trees, because then maybe, they will help ensure that those trees remain standing for some time. So the tree on the left, this is a chestnut oak, and but it's the balding, it's this exfoliation that I want you to see here. And lots of our trees do this when they age. This is a really good field mark, a really good indicator of a tree that is 200 years or more. On the right, this is another oak, a chinkapin oak, but what I want you to see here are the canopy branches. These canopy branches, the shapes of them, all these twists and gnarls and bends and crooks, these are also a really good indicator of a tree that is 200 years and up. If you look in the top of a tree and you see just a small number of very large diameter limbs, you're probably looking at a very old tree, very old for us here in the Northeast. If you look in the background trees of the first image on the left, you can kind of see some of the canopies in the background. Everything is pretty straight. The limbs are long. There's not a lot of crooks and bends. Those are all very young trees. And for me, I should say very young is, under 100 years, under 125 years. For our trees, that's pretty young. Have a look at these trees. So Here, this red oak, you can see the basal bark exfoliation here. Another image of that. This tree is 200 years or higher. And the three trees on the left, those are all red oaks. The one on the right is an ash. And just note their structure, right? They have these large, very large horizontal limbs. So these trees grew in an open setting. They focus not on height growth, but on limb growth. They had no reason to go high because there was no competition around them. So trees are very plastic. They grow where they need to grow. They grow where it's most efficient for them. They can focus on height growth. They can focus on limb growth. They can focus on diameter growth. Whatever the environment is cueing them, the tree will grow in a way that is best for it in that environment. In this particular situation, the environment was a sheep pasture throughout all the 1800s and into the first half of the 1900s. And then that pasture was abandoned, and you can see the matrix of trees that has filled in around. And so now these young trees are starting to shade out the lowest limbs of these old trees. This one here is a little bit of the opposite situation. This straight trunk, you would look at this tree and say, well, that's an open grown tree. Of course, you can see it's growing in the open, but it has all these spreading limbs. But just like those tulip poplars that all came out of that old farm field I showed you earlier, all of these limbs came out at the same time when the forest around this tree was completely cleared. And you could go up to this little stub here at the bottom and count the rings, and you would see that this branch dates to the late 1960s. And then you could look at old aerial photos, and you would be confirmed. You would see, yeah, in the 1960s, the landowner cleared what was a forest and turned it into sort of a kind of an open savanna type landscape, because they wanted to get into a kind of a hobby cattle grazing thing. So this tree was forest grown, and then later it was open grown. And lastly here on our tree shape, this is a resprout, or we might call it a coppice tree. And you can see the stump here. This is a black oak that was cut in the early 1960s. And as many of our trees have the capacity to do, this tree resprouted from the stump. It would have at first had many sprouts, like dozens of sprouts, all coming off the edge of the stump. And then those sprouts all compete with each other, much like trees growing in a forest would. And here, two of them have made it. These two are still alive. This middle one is now dead. It's still standing, but it's dead. And you can still see this very little sprout here down on the bottom that died probably decades ago. So this is a resprout. These are very, very common in our forest. Anytime you see a tree in our forest with two trunks, that is one tree that was cut or otherwise damaged, forcing it to resprout. Stone walls, I spend a lot of time looking at stone, other stonework, legacies, all this kind of stuff. The very simple way to sort of sort out our stone features if you're walking in the forest is look at the size of the stones. If you see like that wall in the background that there are a lot of very small stones, like tennis ball sized, baseball sized stones, then those probably came out of a crop field. Because as you gardeners know, every spring you get a new crop of stones coming up out of the soil from freeze thaw, and those stones had to get removed out of the crop field. The stone wall in the foreground here, made up of entirely large stones, this was built up to be a fence. And so from the period around 1810 to around 1840, there wasn't a lot of timber left to go around, and making wooden fences is kind of a losing proposition, right? They rot. At that time, they were all zigzag fences, and they were sitting on the ground, and you get 20 years out of them, and then they're done, and you need more wood. And wood became a precious commodity. So the stones were taken out of the pastures and out of the forest even, and stacked up into fences. So here are two examples here. On the top one, that is a stone dump that is on the edge of an old crop field, made up of all small stones, mostly round old glacial stones. The one on the bottom is the beginnings of a fence in a pasture in very sandy soil of New Hampshire. And so you look at that and you say, that's never going to hold any sheep in or out of anything. And that's true. This was kind of the early goings at this, and it would have been propped up with trees, wood rails, stumps, all that stuff would have been pushed up against this thing to make it suitable for keeping animals in or out of a field. And lastly, on the stonework is one of these. You might call this a clearance cairn, sometimes just called a stone heap in the old vernacular. And this is just getting stones out of a pasture or a hay field, sometimes even a crop field. Obviously, that bottom stone was not going to be moved back in the early days without machinery. And so these stones were taken out of the field and just stacked up on it. This is very, very common, can find all over. And if you look at the forest composition here, this is a black cherry, this is a red maple, this is a black locust. These are all tree species that you would very much expect to find growing out of an old field, an old agricultural field. Yeah, these stone cairns, there's a lot of discussion around these sorts of features. There are stacked stone features made by indigenous people, right up into and of course well before historic times. And so there are sort of two camps of people. Well, there are more than two camps, but there are camps of people who say, many or most of these are indigenous made, and other people who would say, no, these are all European settler made. And I would say, if you find yourself looking at a stone pile, I would say consider the context. So what I've just showed you here with the tree context, this is very clearly, this was an old field, maybe 75 years ago. And so this is, and the other stone piles that are around here are very clearly European agriculture. There are lots of other stoneworks that have, particularly down by you and farther south in the Hudson Valley, a lot of stone chambers and other interesting features that were made under different cultural periods. And lastly here on the field marks is my PSA is always count tree rings. If you're walking down a trail and a tree fell across the trail and someone has cut through it, just have a glance, have a look at the tree rings and see what you see. This is an ash here, and I want you to see these 3 periods of this tree's growth. You're looking at about a tree that's maybe 15 inches in diameter. And starting here when this tree was young, you can see these very tight growth rings at the center of the tree. And that's because, well, we'll explain them here in a minute. Very tight rings in the beginning, and then very, very quickly, something changed, and this tree had very open, wide growth rings. And then in the last few years of its life, they went back to being small again. This is an ash, and if this tree started in the forest with these very, very tight growth rings, this tree was canopy suppressed, not a lot of light up until it was about, 4 or 5 inches in diameter. And then in July of 1989, there was a massive storm in this area. And the property that this tree is on is about 200 acres, and they lost over 600 trees in that event. And so the overstory was taken away. This tree was given full light, and then it grew very, very quickly for the next 30 years. And then the last few years, the emerald ash borer made its way into this tree, and the tree's growth slowed incredibly until it died, and then it was cut. And this is the stump that is remaining. So a great story of, 60 years or more of forest history captured in this one stump and the growth rings. This is my house, and you can file this one in. Sometimes you don't see cobwebs in your own house, and this tree, this property has been in my family since I was born, and we always thought that when they built the house, that they mounded up this mound and planted this red oak on top. And the house was built in the late 30s, and a few years ago, I rented a lift, and I went up into this tree to prune it out, and I pruned out a kind of dead section you can't see. And of course, my previous PSA was always count tree rings, so I always count tree rings. And I looked at it and I thought, gosh, my story for this tree is completely wrong, because this tree is not 1930 originating. This tree originated in 1870s. And you can tell by the structure of this tree that it has always been open grown. This was not a forest tree. So that raises a number of interesting questions, because there was no agriculture or anything really happening in this area. It was all swampland. You can see a lake out there in the background. And so this blew everything open for me. And so what I found was, what I realized was, I thought back to when I buried my dog 20 years ago. And when I dug the hole, I hit an old leaf layer down about 15 inches, 20 inches down. And so what I've determined happened was, in this swampland that I live in, this was the high ground. This was the height of land. And they bulldozed around this tree to fill in all the low spaces to kind of level out the property to build the house. And they left this, what would have been a probably 75-year-old tree, open grown, probably a nice looking tree, and they decided to keep this tree around to be there with the house. So today on the mound, I have Pennsylvania sedge, I have woodland phlox, I have trout lilies. This is basically a small refugia showing us what my neighborhood was composed of in 1930 and prior, at least in the drier uplands. In the swampy low bits, it's all swamp white oak, red maple, tussock sedges. But in the higher ground, this has never been modified, other than these hostas that were planted who knows when, way back in the day. So taking you to another one of my favorite trees, this one is a chinkapin oak in a wonderful limestone forest in the Ohio River Valley. And I've spent a lot of time on this acre, and I'm going to share this acre with you because it has a really good, with very few elements, this acre captures 400 years of landscape change. So we have this old oak. Let's just go through the composition of what's here. Old oak. We have oak, hickory, and ash, 12 to 15 inches in diameter. That's kind of just most of the trees you're seeing. There are sugar maples, are all these small, very small diameter trees. They're all sugar maples, and they're all 4 to 6 inches in diameter. And then lastly, on the ground, there are stumps of eastern red cedar. And I'll show you a close-up here in a moment. So these are the pieces, these are the elements of this story, these are the characters, and we need to figure out what the chrono sequence, or the temporal sequence of, okay, who was here first, who came last, how did all these things relate to each other? So obviously the old oak got in there first. This tree is about 400 years old. It started, if you notice its form, you might say, hey, nice tree, this is open grown, by looking at the branches, but these branches are fairly narrow diameter considering the diameter of the tree. So this tree is about 400 years old, and based on this tall, very tall, straight trunk, this was a forest-grown tree. And like that tree I showed you earlier, the forest was taken away around it, and that's when it sprouted out with all these shoots. So there's the tree there in the background. This is one of those cedar stumps. This is a sugar maple. This is a hickory. And so these are kind of the elements we're dealing with. Eastern red cedar grows in the limestone areas of the Hudson Valley. I drive down the thruway with some regularity, and I always love seeing, when I get into the limestone belt, all of a sudden you find eastern red cedar. And it reminds me of my time when I was spending in this part of the world, which is limestone. Up where I am, there's no eastern red cedar here, because I live on shale, and then you get to the southern Adirondacks, which is all old metamorphic rocks. And then there's a little band of limestone up around Whitehall, New York, up around Lake Champlain, and voila, eastern red cedar comes back. So it has a lot of site fidelity. And if you want to understand succession in places with limestone, you should understand eastern red cedar. So here, this stump is it's about a foot in diameter, and it is hollowing out here. And a cedar tree about a foot in diameter is probably going to be about 100 years old. And the amount of rot here, it took me a while to figure this out, but cedars are extremely rot resistant, right? You make patio furniture out of and all the rest. And they don't start to rot until about 25 years that they've been sitting as a stump. So that's giving us some sort of vague indication of when this tree might have been cut and how old it was. This is a standing dead. This is the only standing dead eastern red cedar in this patch of forest, is this one right here. And that's because all the stumps that are around, someone cut all these things out. This one was probably dead when they did the cutting. And it has been standing dead here now for almost 50 years. And we'll get to the exact timing of all this in a moment. So this is what that site would have probably looked like around... Well, the tree was 400 years old, and then they cleared the forest around it starting in around 1810, 1820, and the cedars started to come up at around 1860s, 1870s. So this is probably looks like that site around 1890, but you'd have to add that big tree, the big oak, into this thing. But it wasn't as big as it is now because it was 100 years younger then. But that's kind of what cedar succession in old fields looks like. So this tree kind of gave me a big a break in figuring this site out. So here is a cedar stump. This tree was cut, and when they cut this tree, they also cut right through that sugar maple, and the sugar maple resprouted. So if I can count the rings, the growth rings of this sugar maple, then I would know the year that the cedars were cut. And I found a few sugar maples that were resprouts like this, where they had been cut next to a cedar. And it turns out that these cedars and sugar maples were all cut in 1971. And so when we look back at the site here, we have the 400-year-old tree, and then we have all these oak, maple, oak, hickory, and ash. They're all about 12 to 15 inches in diameter, which today I could go and say, yeah, that tree is probably around this age. At the time I did this site, I was really into coring trees, so I cored a whole bunch of trees. They all dated to the 1910s, 19 teens. And so our chronosequence here then is the acorn sprouts in the forest, right, in 1650. This is well before any people of European descent had made it into this part of the country. So that acorn sprouts in a forest. We know based on the shape of the tree that it was forest grown initially. In 1820, the clearing begins and the grazing begins. And the reason I know that is because about a half mile away from this tree is an old stone house that was built in 1810. And so this property was a part of that old stone house. So the clearing could have happened anywhere from 1810 to 1830, but certainly by 1830, this tree was more or less in the open with cattle grazing all around it. 1860s, the cedar begins to establish, and that is based on that I know that the cedars were cut in 1971. And so then I take the diameter of the cedar, and I know that about a 1 foot diameter tree is going to be about 100 years old. And so I'm going back in time the 100 years from when they were cut. So 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, they come in slowly over time, like that picture I showed you a moment ago of the old field cedar. And then 1910s, the hardwoods start coming in, and the cedars are no longer coming in at this point because they don't do well in shade. 1950s, the sugar maple comes in. Sugar maple is a very shade tolerant tree. It starts off in the understory, is very typical, and over time it'll make its way into the overstory. It's a very patient tree. And then in 1971, the cedars are cut, and they were actually milled on site here. There's the remains of the portable sawmill they used, and the maples were coppiced. And then since, I should probably change that, since more like the 1980s or 90s, overabundant deer have been the driving factor on this site. So that image in the bottom right of the flowers, that's all wild hyacinth and dwarf larkspur, trilliums, all the plants that are in that image are toxic or otherwise unpalatable to deer. There is zero forest regeneration happening in this particular acre. There are no trees coming up because anything that comes up is getting browsed down by deer. And so the future of this forest is when these sugar maples reach the canopy, and maybe in another 50 to 100 years, the oaks and hickories are going to start coming down. The sugar maple will make it in the understory, and there is nothing in this forest to replace them. But there is this really great, almost 400-year history of landscape change on this one particular acre. So I am very much into large old trees. I'm very much into what we might call a wolf tree like this, and the tree I just showed you, the chinkapin oak on that site. And I want to just take a quick interlude here and share you a little bit of information on the disproportionate value of trees like this in a forest. So this is a sugar maple, and this photo is about 10 years old. The tree was alive then. This tree is dead now. And this was one of the trees that was in my, when I did my graduate research, my master's thesis, this was one of my research trees. And I'll share with you, don't be afraid of all the numbers. It's not as bad as it looks. What I did was I wanted to try to understand whether these large old trees in a forest have disproportionate value when compared to a standard commercially mature forest tree. Because for the last, from about the 1930s up until maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and even still to the present day in some locations, silvicultural orthodoxy would tell you to cut down these trees or to kill them, girdle them, do whatever you need to do because they have no monetary value. And that's true. They don't have monetary value. They're probably not even worth firewood. But I wanted to see if they had other values. So I had 28 of these old legacy trees, and I paired each one to a control tree of the same species in the same stand. And then in this table, I sat in front of each tree for 2 hours one summer in half-an-hour blocks. And this is the data, this is the table for all the bird activity. So here in the legacy trees, I counted 11,000 seconds of birds landing in these old legacy trees. And then I'll break that down by behavior here in a moment. In the control trees, this is a standard commercially mature forest tree, 12 to 15 inches in diameter. I had 1,100 seconds of birds landing in those trees. So a tenfold difference in the amount of time birds are spending in these trees. When you break it down by behavior, so feeding 6,000 seconds in the large old trees compared to less than 300 seconds in the control trees. So that's a 21-fold difference in the amount of time that birds are spending feeding in those large old trees compared to the commercially mature forest trees. Singing, it's a 35-fold difference. So male birds are identifying these large old trees as valuable territory, and they are defending them through singing. That's what singing, part of the behavior of singing is. And perching, which is the behavior that is the least important for individual or reproductive fitness, meaning birds need to eat, and if they're going to reproduce, they need to sing, but they don't really need to perch. Nonetheless, it's a twofold difference in the amount of time they spent perching. So it's not as different, but that's not as important of a behavior. So these birds are identifying these trees as valuable, and they are feeding in them disproportionately. I just wanted to mention signs. So this is looking for signs of mammals, feces, fur, feathers around the base of a tree. If you find one of these old trees in the woods, there's a 50% chance that you're going to find a carnivore scat at the bottom of the tree. Some people would say, well, they're scent marking, they're identifying territory. That may be true. I'm not a fox. I don't know what they're doing. But they are using these trees in ways that they're not using just a random tree in the forest. They are identifying these trees as something and having behavior that reflects that. So one quick story from the woods. This is a large old chinkapin oak that I found one day, and I was setting up to photograph this tree, and this little creature bolted out of the bottom of the tree. This is a coyote. and you can notice this silver stripe on her back. So she came out of the bottom of the tree. There's a hole there, which, forgive me, you can't see it with the shadow. And I'll show you here the hole in a second. And so what do? I need to go stick my head in the hole. And there are the 7 little adorable puppies that are in the bottom of the tree. And I got this junk photograph because I didn't want to use a flash because I didn't want to damage their eyes or anything. So I got this crap photograph, and then I literally walked out of the forest. I went over to an outdoor store and I bought a motion sensing trail cam, and I set it up in front of the tree and left it there for 3 weeks. And this image is the very first time that these coyote puppies came out of the tree. And they're just so cuddly and adorable. And so here they are, just exploring for the very first time. I'm a little surprised they went out without mom. Now here they are exploring the tree. There's mom with the silver stripe on her back, doing what dogs do, giving herself a bath. And there are the little pups. They are wandering and exploring, and it's just cute and cuddly. And the last little clip here is lunchtime. Everyone's getting a little lunch, except this one little puppy that's still in the tree. And that would be me. If I had a choice between eating or checking out a large old tree, I'm taking the tree every time. So animals are identifying these trees as extremely valuable habitats. You cannot find another place in this forest where that kind of very sensitive sort of animal behavior can even occur. That's not to say coyotes are rare or uncommon. They can find places just about anywhere, but that's a really good place. And you can imagine several hundred years ago, we would have had lots and lots of trees like this. And now our forests, by and large, are quite young, 100 years or less. So that's that interlude. The last bit here I want to share with you is this site. I think we might go a little bit over time, so bear with me. If you have to check out, that's okay. This is a little 8-acre inholding in a place in Northwest Connecticut called Great Mountain Forest, and Yale University owns a little patch in here. It used to be a farm back in the day. Now they have a kind of a classroom there that was built in 1940, and kind of a forestry camp. And so my job here was to try to reconstruct what this place looked like when it was a farm. So the first thing I did was I went to the deeds, and I got all the ownership information out of the deeds. This one from 1795, 300 pounds lawful money, Elijah Mansfield, on and on and on. Very tedious. I'm not going to ask you to read this. And what I get out of the deeds are the meets and bounds description describing the property has all these trees in it. So these are the year of the deeds, and these are the new species that were in the deed on any given year. What you have here is basically what this site still is today. It is a hemlock northern hardwood forest. There's maybe 20 different species here. There are chestnut trees, all kinds of stuff. It's the same sort of stuff you would see out on this site if you walked out there today. The other thing I got out of the deeds are the boundaries of the land, of the property. So this farm was in 2 parcels, totaling about 300 acres. And so you get the meets and bounds description out of the deed, and then I could map that out. And then once I have that, I can hit the field. And here, so if you remember those field marks I shared with you back in the beginning, what we're going to do here is we're going to take all these field marks from all 300 acres, and then we're going to try to sort out what was the land use happening on any particular acre, considering the field marks we see today. So all these yellow areas, these are areas where I saw smooth ground. So you remember smooth ground is area that was plowed at least once, maybe multiple times, and it kind of just smoothed all the pits and mounds out. So all these areas were the areas that had smooth ground. And when you go into the forest, this is pretty typical of what you'd see in those areas. This is from one of those areas. So look at the ground. The ground is very, very smooth, no pits, no mounds, very few undulations. And it's dominated by paper birch. Paper birch is an early successional tree. It thrives in full sun. So that makes sense that paper birch would come up in an old agricultural field. These trees now are about 100 years old, 110. So that's getting pretty old for paper birch. They're going to start falling and aging out as the decades go on. So back at our map here, the yellow areas are those smooth ground, and now I've added the stones and other legacies. So the gray dots are clearance cairns. Those are those stone piles. And the lines, the gray lines, are stone walls. And what's really interesting is they kind of like to hang out together. The smooth ground likes to be around the places with stone piles and stone walls. There's not smooth ground out here, and there's no stonework out there either. There's this one little satellite area here. We'll talk about that in a little while. So you go wandering around here. This is by the Yale Forestry Camp. Here's a stone wall here. This is where the farm house and all that stuff was, so you'd expect to see stone walls around there. This is a little farther afield, but not too far. These stones are making a little L here. This was the foundation of a barn, maybe 100 meters, maybe a little more, 100 to 125 meters away from where the house was. This is a clearance cairn. You can see it's well stacked. It's kind of falling apart now, but it was stacked up back in the day. And this is a wall, also well stacked. So this wall was used as a fence. Not a lot of small stones here. So this was probably not in regular crop production. This was a hay field. And the wall here is keeping animals out. They're keeping the animals on our side of the image. And the inside of that image is where the hay was. So this would have probably had a rail on top. It would have been a much more robust thing at the time. Most of it's fallen over now, but that would have been a hay field inside that wall. So back to our map here, we've got our smooth ground, we've got our walls and clearance cairns. Now, a different set of features here. The yellow is not smooth ground anymore. The yellow is dense infestations of Japanese barberry, an exotic species that does really well in old pastures and old hay fields.
Oh,
So, sorry, was there a question? Nope. So these areas are all Japanese barberry. So it's not certain that those were in agriculture, but when you find lots of Japanese barberry, you should at least be thinking, okay, maybe this was agricultural. I need more information. So the green dots that I have here are old spreading pasture trees, those wolf trees that I really love so much. So here is
Why do you call them wolf trees?
oh, that's a great question. Let's circle back to that at the end, if that's okay.
Sure.
Just because I don't want to derail us, and we could spend 40 minutes talking just about that. So let's circle back to that. But great question. Here's a clearance cairn, right? Pile of stones on top of a rock, but this is all Japanese barberry. Everywhere around here is Japanese barberry. Here is one of these old pasture trees. This is a white oak. This tree is about 225 years old. This was growing in the open setting of the pasture starting when this farm was established in 1795. Here's one that's a red oak. It's much younger. This tree probably only 125 years old. This tree was probably just coming up in the pasture just before this whole farm operation was dissolved. And so there are a lot of those green dots I had on that map are trees very similar in stature to this one. It would have looked much like this back in the day. We would have called this a brush field or brush pasture. That was even a technical term in tax records. And this is what that tree probably looked like around 1910 or 1920. So we also have some resprout trees. I didn't point those out on the map. We'll come back to the map here in a moment. This tree was cut in 1865. This is a black oak that was cut repeatedly. So you can see the 4 stems here. It was cut, it resprouted, it was cut again, it resprouted farther apart. So there's a lot of space in between these stems, and that's because every time it resprouts, it's getting farther and farther and farther apart. And so I don't know when the last cutting of this was, probably the very early 1900s or late 1800s. This tree was cut in 1879. And I want you to remember that because we're going to come back to this tree in a moment when we look at some archives. But this was I don't know if it's a red oak or a black oak, but there was another stem here. There was 3 stems, and this stem did not make it. And so decay got in there, rotted it out, and now this is the home of some small mammal or medium-sized mammal. I don't know if it's a squirrel or a porcupine or who's in there, or even a little fox, but somebody has been living inside that. So back to our map, these orange dots are all those resprout or coppice trees. And I didn't mark all of the resprout or coppice trees because if I had, I would still be out there 4 years later marking all of the locations for all these coppice trees. There are dozens per acre, and there are 150 acres here. What I was interested in is where is the line? Where is the line between the green dots, the open pasture trees, and the orange dots, the forest-grown resprout trees? And that line is basically right here. Everything to the east is green dots, pasture. Everything to the west is forest resprouts. So this is the arrangement of that farm somewhere around 1880, 1890. So the dark green here that's filling up most of the west side, that was forest. And if you look at the tax records of this property or the agricultural census records, which we'll do here in a moment, they listed 150 acres of unimproved land. And that's right here. I have it, as I've drawn it here, I have 160 acres of forest, or what they called unimproved land. This kind of paler green, kind of wrapping around here, that's all the pasture. Here I have it marked out at 59 acres, 54 acres. And that corresponds, as I'll show you here in a moment, with the number of cattle that they averaged over the life of the farm. These yellow areas, 1, 2, and 3, these areas are hay fields. As I've drawn them, they total 19 acres, which I'll show you here in a moment, corresponds to what was in the archives. The brown area is the farm core. That's where the row crops would be. They grew potatoes and oats and barley. All that stuff was happening down here where it's flat. The rest of this ground is kind of slopey and thin soiled. A couple areas I don't know are this kind of olive area. This is under a beaver pond now, so it's either a pasture or more crop field or some mixture of the two, which is probably the likely case, or it was probably wet pasture. A lot of wetlands had cattle in them, and same for the downstream one over here. Probably more wet pasture, probably fairly unproductive swampy bits that today is all sort of alder and winterberry holly shrub wetland. So I mentioned the archives. This is the list, the chain of custody, the ownership history. And we're not going to go through all the owners. There's no need to do that. What I want you to see is the number of acres. There's 320 acres of the farm. All kinds of debts taken. What I want you to see here is 1874, a $900 loan was taken from the bank against this property. And then in 1880, that $900 loan was paid back. And that actually is going to come back to the forest here in a second. This is the agricultural census record. What I want you to see here in 1880, they had 1 acre of corn, 3 acres of oats, 1¼ acre of potatoes. They were primarily a dairy farm. They produced 500 acres of butter. There's the hay, 20 acres in 1880. It was in tons in the previous years, 40 tons, 20 tons. That would make sense for about 20 acres. Up here, improved acres and unimproved. That's as I was discussing. Those are the hay fields, crop fields, and improved pasture versus the woodland 150 or 140, and then 85 was brush pasture. And here's the number of animals. Generally, at any given time, they had between 15 and 20 cattle. The last thing I want to point out is the bottom here, and that's the number of wood cords cut. In 1879, they cut 1,300 cords of wood off that 150 acres. So that was a big cut. There was a lot of charcoaling activity in this area. There were blast furnaces. So this was all cut to go to be charcoal. They got $1,000, less than $1 a cord for the wood. What did they do with the $1,000 in 1880? They paid off the loan at the bank, the $900 loan. So here we have 21st century wildlife ecology is colliding against 19th century home economics at the dinner table. The legacy of this cutting is persistent now throughout this forest. These resprout trees are everywhere, and they will start to decline over the next decades to a century. So this is kind of it. This is the picture of this farm from very early 1900s, probably 1905, not later than 1910, because you can see the bed sheets there out on the line. And Ellen Mansfield Chatterton died in 1910, and she had 10 children in that house, and well, 11, and 10 of them made it, which is kind of amazing. And then she was living there alone in the 1910 census record, and then she died, and the place was no longer inhabited. So that is the story there. If you have questions, happy to entertain those. I'll stop sharing my screen. Let me get out of here.
All right. Thank you, Michael, for a great talk. I'm going to take the liberty of doing the first question, and then people can pipe in. You can also raise your hand under, I think it's under reactions. Anyway, you've talked a lot about trees, but not a huge amount about understory, berries, certain plants, maybe wildflowers. Do those also give you clues as to what's going on?
They do, particularly, yeah, both in terms of presence and absence, right? So let's start with the ones we all really love, right? That's the spring ephemeral wildflowers. So you go out into the forest and you find things like bloodroot and blue cohosh and trilliums, and wild ginger, trout lilies, all these wonderful spring flowers that flower out, starting in April, and they flower through May. And really by June, they're done, they're gone. The presence of those indicates that that area has never been tilled, because these are all very long-lived perennials, the seeds of which are mostly dispersed by ants. So they are exceptionally slow to recolonize a forest after it has been abandoned from field and comes back. So when you see those, it's like, okay, this has always been forested. It's not necessarily old growth. It may have been timbered, but it's always been forested. The absence of those tells the same story, right? If you have none of that stuff, and you have smooth ground, and you have a bunch of forest weeds like Japanese barberry, honeysuckle, garlic mustard, all those things, then you should be thinking about or be pretty certain that there was some kind of agricultural activity happening in that location. So yeah, so there is a great story there. There's also the soil fertility story, or a soil nutrient load story. So there's a great study that I can, what was the name of it? I don't know. Smith I just gave it to my students a week ago, and we did a bunch of soil tests at an old home site here. And what this study was they looked at old abandoned home sites in Tennessee, and they, in addition to they looked at the soil, the trees, and archaeological. And when they looked at the soil, they kind of ran these radiating transects from the home site out for, I don't know, 100 meters or more, and they tested the soil every so often. And what they found was, even though the local soil, the local bedrock is very acidic in that location, the closer you are to the home site, the more highly elevated in pH and nutrients, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, manganese, everything was highly elevated the closer you are to the home site. So that's all the waste products that are coming out of that house, right? Everything from the food scraps to the ash to the organic matter going into that house for food. everything, the chickens that are pecking around outside the house, they're all loading that soil with nutrients. And so when we were out, when Wendy and Alan and I were out last year, we found a site very similar where there was an old abandoned home site, very little relics of the home site that I recollect, but it was in an oak forest, and everything around the house was sugar maple, and sugar maple needs highly enriched soil. And so that's why the sugar maple was on that site, is because of all of the waste products that were coming out of that house and enriching that soil. And the sugar maple was able to outcompete the oaks in that situation. So yeah, so everything, all these plants are highly tuned to what's going on out there. And in those understory plants, I kind of just went off on soil fertility in trees, but those understory plants are also responding very deliberately to those soil cues.
Other questions?
Well, what was a wolf tree?
Yes, so good. So great question. So a wolf tree is, if you were to read a forestry textbook from any time in the 1900s, and perhaps even a modern one, I got to look in the newest ones and see what they say. And this is a direct quote, and they would say, these trees are preying on forest resources, and like a wolf, they should be culled. Because if you think back through all of human history, essentially, except for our, and I say this sort of tongue-in-cheek, our enlightened 21st century, Eastern North American perspective, where we think wolves are wonderful, at least I do. For pretty much all of human history, wolves have been the most denigrated and persecuted species of animal in history, period. And so when the foresters are saying these trees are preying on forest resources and like a wolf they should be culled, they are embracing, over probably 2,000 years of European approaches to that species. Unfortunately, that explanation is not correct. And so I've traced the history of the term wolf tree back to Old Norse poetry from the 800s, Saxon, all of those Germanic languages, Saxon, Old Norse, Old English, Old German. There is a word for wolf, which happens to be the same word as criminal. The word is warg. So you think of Tolkien and the wargs in Lord of the Rings. Those were those wolf-like things. That's where he got that word. And so there's all this old history about the execution of people and wolves, essentially hanging them from trees. And that's where we get the term wolf tree, is it goes back to the persecution of the animal and the criminal, who was in many of those old Germanic Northern Europe societies. In England, they had a law on the books that was called caput lupinum, which is the Latinized version of the head of the wolf. And if you've committed some heinous crime and the sheriff can't find you, then a judge could declare you caput lupinum, and that would allow any citizen to kill you with impunity. And so these people then had the same rights as a wolf, which was none. And so they were on the run, they lived in the trees, Robin Hood, all that kind of stuff, and they would be executed as soon as they were found, just like a wolf. So that's the short version of the history of the wolf tree term. Full disclosure, I'm working on a book on the subject, so stay tuned for that. It's probably, I don't know how many years away it is. If I could ever find the time to work on it, I will. But there is a great and the 1,300-year-long story, at least, in the history of the term.
So what do you use that?
Say again?
What do you use that for, these trees that you cherish?
Yeah, so that's a great question. No one's ever asked me that. So in the beginning, when I started doing this, when I was a graduate student, now 17 years ago, I detested the term. I thought, because all the forestry handbooks, they all say just cut these trees down like a wolf. And I thought, this is horrible. So you saw in my slide there that I called them legacy trees. And that's the word that I preferred for a long time. But when I finally found out the deep history of this term, I really embrace it now, because it is a fascinating aspect of the English and all the Germanic languages, that it's carried on. Because if you go to Europe, they only use this term now in a strict silvicultural sense. They've lost this deeper history behind the word. And so I spent time in the UK, and I talked to lots of forest people, and I say, what do you know about the term wolf tree? And they say, well, it's a large limby tree that dominates the trees around it. And I say, okay, fair enough. And I move on to the next person. And so I've come to really embrace the term wolf tree, because it has so much baggage attached to it. 1,200 years of differing usages of the word with deeply religious aspects. And so I've really come to embrace it.
You could
Okay,
call
we have
it
a bunch.
Keystone tree.
Judith, I want to move on. We've got, and you can come back to you, but we've got a bunch of other questions. Penny?
This is quick.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you are calling wolf trees or legacy trees what Suzanne Simard called a mother tree.
Yeah, great question.
Right.
So when I dig back into working on my wolf tree project, I'm going to try to contact her, because I had often thought with my old wolf trees that, they were standing there alone in the field, right? And all of the mycorrhizal fungus that would be on a tree that needs roots, tree roots as hosts, if you're out in the middle of the pasture field, I would suspect that you're not going to find those species of mycorrhizal fungus out in the middle of the pasture if they need tree roots to connect to. So I had often thought, like, yeah, these old pasture trees, they are the original kind of the catalyst of repopulating forest soils. And then she kind of has the whole mother tree thing, which is kind of along those same lines. So I really need to talk to her, is the bottom line.
You need to talk to her.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's actually gonna, if there's like reality in that wish of mine or not. But I think, your observation is the same as my observation, that there's a lot of similarity there, a lot of fertile ground for, they're kind of the same. So
it was one of the things that she said that was so inspirational was that the mother trees take care of the other trees around them, and sometimes cross species. And I just thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, she pioneered some really cool studies, not even that long ago, right? 90s, maybe early 2000s. So really, really cool stuff that she did.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Eileen? Still there?
Sorry,
So,
I'm muted. So, did you say Eileen or Alan?
Yeah, Maria, were you jumping in or?
No, she's
I
had
didn't
her
hear you
hand
say
up.
Eileen. Go ahead,
Okay,
Eileen.
Eileen.
Well, I had two questions. Hopefully they'll be short. One was about deer. You mentioned that one forest that wasn't going to rejuvenate because the deer coming in and eating. And I'm just wondering how big of a problem that is. And then, I know it's a problem for gardeners, but generally speaking for our forests. And then my other question is just kind of so I understand you gather all this information, but how does it really impact us? How does it tell us what to do in the future? How are you using the information?
That's a great question. I'll take the second one first. So what do you do with this information? Well, one, it just satisfies curiosities, and it helps explain the distribution of forest composition and structure in a forest, right? That it's like you're walking through the forest, it's like, well, these plants are over here, but they're not over here. What's going on there? So this kind of helps explain, can help explain some of that to some degree. And what you do with that's going to be really, landowner specific, right? And so they may look at their forest and say, well, I see this stand is kind of like this, and this stand is kind of like that. If I share with them the reasons why those two forest stands are different, is that going to change their motivations for how they want to manage that forest? I don't know, sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people get so fascinated by the history of it, they're like, I'm not going to do anything in here because this, like, now I know how it all works, and so why would I go in here and cut anything? So it's really person and site specific on that. The other question, about the deer. Yeah, so some areas where there's not a lot of deer pressure, forests regenerate just fine. That particular site that I shared with you, they have 175 deer per square mile. A healthy deer population would be somewhere between 10 and 30 deer per square mile. So they are like light years away. And this is like, even where I live up here in Saratoga County, I have seen, we used to see a deer and it was like a big deal. And now they're kind of like hoofed locusts, right? They're just sort of everywhere. So tree regeneration is a big deal. Some forests, the bigger the forest, like unfragmented acres, generally speaking, the less that deer overpopulation is. It's when the forest gets fragmented and you have a lot of edges and a lot of residential areas, that's when the deer kind of get crazy. And it's hard to control because the only way to control it, you need to kill the deer. And I was just down at Valley Forge National Park, Revolutionary War site, Eastern Pennsylvania. And they, back a long time ago when I was working on that Kentucky project, they were kind of doing some pretty aggressive deer management. And so I stopped in there the other day, the first time I ever been in the park, and I talked to a very knowledgeable ranger, and she said, yeah, our deer population was 1,600 deer in the 2,000-acre park. And over, I think she said about 10 years, through very intensive culling, they got their deer population down to 160. So they cut that deer population by 90% in 10 years, and they are now seeing tree regeneration in the forest in Valley Forge. So was it controversial? Yes, highly. Was it aggressive? Yeah, but that's what they did. And they basically had professionals culling out the deer in mass, like culling 200 deer in a night. And they have now got that population back down to a reasonable level, and trees will regenerate. So we all love the deer, but if you want a forest 50 years from now, you can't have too many deer. We don't have predators anymore taking the deer out, so somebody's got to do it.
Stu?
Maria.
Maria?
Just a comment, really. It's just so interesting how human culture intersects with forestry. And one of the things that I found out recently is that Paul Bunyan is a complete fabrication of the lumber industry. And, he has such an all-American, kind of, Paul Bunyan, and, the one leg longer than the other, and Babe the Blue Ox, and Lucretia Kensack, his girlfriend, and all that, and all the giant statues out in the Midwest. And he was just a complete fabrication in order to get people to buy into this whole thing about how lumberjacks are burly and wonderful and American heroes, and kind of like the bad rap that they gave wolves, they turned around and built up lumberjacks as heroes.
Right. Huh, interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard that, and I wouldn't be surprised. I think I can personally live without Paul Bunyan, but I'm not sure I can live without Babe the Blue Ox. That was kind of that's the legend right there, right?
Yeah.
Thanks
Babe.
for sharing that. Anything else?
Stu?
Yeah, I did have a question. This is Stuart. I did have a question. I hit the start video instead of the unmute button a second ago. It was about eastern red cedar. We have some land and with lots of eastern red cedar on it, but I've always thought it sat on top of a shale ridge. You mentioned limestone as supporting eastern red cedar, but are there factors like lots of moisture, or maybe I have more limestone than I know?
Well, no, and you might have, so Eastern Red Cedar doesn't know that it's limestone. What Eastern Red Cedar knows is that it tends to be nutrient rich. And so you may have a nutrient rich shale, like a limey shale, or shale and limestone, the environments in which those rock types occur or were deposited, they're both marine environments. Shale is sort of deeper water marine. So shale is made up of very, very fine suspended clays that eventually settle out into the bottom, the depths of the sea. Limestone is mostly the calcium carbonate shells of marine organisms, kind of like a reef, coral reef, and all these other creatures that were, so it's a bit shallower. So you may have kind of a limey shale or just a shale that has a bit more of the calcium, phosphorus, et cetera, in it. Does red cedar occur on environments that are not limestone or even highly nutrient rich? Yeah, once in a while it does. If you get on a very dry site, you know, in Northwest Connecticut or Western Mass, even if it's sort of a old, hard metamorphic rock, you still might find little pockets of eastern red cedar here and there, primarily because they can tolerate very dry, thin soils, and nothing else can. So it's kind of like, you know, the maple and the beech, they can't even hack that kind of an environment, yet the eastern red cedar can. So eastern red cedar can grow incredibly slowly. I think the oldest one known is 900 years old, growing on these very, very dry, rocky barrens down in West Virginia. So your site, it could be a limey shale, it could just be a little nutrient rich, it could just be a little bit of a dry kind of anomaly. But yeah, they're not completely kind of site fidelity to limestone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have some black locusts that are apparently very old, and large pieces of the bark seems to just fall off. Does that mean that you can either age them through that, or that they're on their last legs in any way?
Yeah, black locust is one that seemingly always has this distressed appearance. It just always looks kind of beaten and withered and everything else. But they do persist. They sort of keep reorganizing and putting up new shoots and whatever. I can't speak specifically to your tree, whether or not it's kind of on its way out. But they do often have this kind of, this kind of tired look to them.
Yeah, but you don't worry if large pieces of bark just sort of fall off?
I wouldn't worry too much about large pieces of bark falling off. But once that bark has fallen off, if it's like a large dead part of the stem that's just kind of hanging out over your garage, that's something you might think about calling somebody. But they often have like dead sections, and when those dead sections fall off, they, like those oaks that we talked about getting coppice and resprout, when that dead bit, they resprout, you know, halfway up the tree, they'll put up new suckers. They also put up suckers from the roots. They put up clones. They are remarkably tenacious tree. They're probably the greatest exotic tree, invasive tree species in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. It's like Atlantis for us. I mean, it's taking over everything in Poland and Romania and everywhere. It's an incredible tree. But it also has lots of great attributes, right? It's got incredible flowers for honey. It's a pea family, so it's a nitrogen fixer. It's one of the most rot-resistant woods in all of North America, so great for fence posts or any exterior application. Personally, I can't say enough good things about it, but a lot of people really don't like it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've got one more, if I could ask just one question. Do you have a recommendation for a trail cam? That was wonderful footage of your coyote, and I've wondered what's in my woods. I know there are some. I mean, I know there are coyotes over there, but I'd like to see them. And I know there are cameras that have like cellular communication, so you can see the images without having to traipse out daily to get a SD card. But what do you like to use?
Yeah, so I'm probably not the best to answer this question because I'm Scottish and I'm cheap, and so I still have my trail cam from 2006. I have 2 of those, and that's what I use. And they're not, compared to what's out there today, they're not, the image quality is not as great. And then you have all these cellular, as you're mentioning, these cellular ones today that just send the images right to you, which is pretty amazing. So I would do the same. I would suggest to you what I would do is just get online and look at the reviews. And I think there's even a site, it's like trailcams.com, and they sell a ton of them, and they have reviews for all of them. But I would look for one that has really good image quality if that's important to you. That's what would be important to me. And then if the cellular aspect was important, also don't be afraid to bait them. I had a group of students one time, this was a winter ecology course, and we took a roadkill beaver and we put it up in a tree and we wired it to the tree. And we got incredible photos. One photo of 3 bobcats all together staring up into this tree because the beaver was too high for the bobcats unless they climb the tree, and so they're just all staring at the tree. It's the greatest photo ever. So if you find if you're okay with a little gore, find something roadkill, and you got to really wire it to the tree so that it can't be removed easily. And then you may get some really awesome photos.
I think with that, we will thank Michael for
that is the take-home
enlightening.
message: is to go find roadkill.
And I also want to point out, Michael put the name of the watercolorist into the chat.
Yes, Autumn von Plinsky is her name. She's got a website. Check her out.
Oh,
Okay.
Alan, somebody else has a question.
Oh,
Or was that a thank you? The B.
I don't know. Does anybody else have a question? All right. Again,
Well, if anything
Michael,
comes up, Alan's got my email. You've got the website. You can get me that way. But feel free to send a question or a photo of a strange tree. Always happy to opine.
And Michael, I'm right. You will do walks with people around their property as a gift or some. I mean, they pay you, and yeah, right.
Yeah. So and it runs the gamut from spend a half day walking around to a full kind of deep dive with the archives and everything. I mean, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you.
yes,
Great. Well, thanks
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Ellen, for
Thank
setting
you.
it up.
Thank you.